Have you ever found yourself in the middle of Mass, everything around you quiet, the voices fading, the atmosphere almost suspended in time, and suddenly your eyes begin to fill with tears for no reason you can clearly explain? It is not loud crying, not dramatic, not something you decide or prepare for. Sometimes it is just a subtle trembling inside, a silent moisture that appears without permission. Other times it rises more strongly, like something deep within your chest breaking the surface and spilling out right there in front of the altar. And in that moment, a question silently forms in the mind, the same question many souls carry in secret. What is happening to me? Why am I crying here? Am I overreacting? Is something wrong with me? You try to hold it back. You lower your gaze, wipe your eyes quickly, hoping no one notices, almost feeling a quiet embarrassment as if this reaction does not belong in such a sacred place. Maybe you were taught, directly or indirectly, that crying in church is weakness, that faith should always look composed, controlled, and calm, and yet deep inside, you sense something different. These tears do not feel like ordinary sadness, exhaustion, or emotional overwhelm. They come from a place deeper than thought, deeper than memory, deeper than everyday feeling. It is as if something ancient inside you recognizes something that the mind cannot fully explain. Because when Jesus becomes present on the altar, when the Eucharist becomes that mysterious moment where heaven touches earth, the soul, even without intellectual understanding, recognizes its Lord. And this recognition does not always come in words or clear thoughts. Sometimes it expresses itself through breaking, through surrender, through tears that rise without explanation. Today we are entering into a mystery that many people experience but few truly speak about, a quiet, delicate spiritual mystery. We are going to explore why these tears are not a mistake or emotional distraction, but a language of the soul, a form of communication that appears when the human heart encounters something eternal. Through the spiritual insights and experiences of St. Faustina Kowalska, we begin to understand that crying during Mass is not a sign of emotional instability, but a response that carries deep spiritual meaning. Before we continue, take a moment to hold this simple prayer in your heart. Jesus, receive my tears as prayer, not as words to pass over quickly, but as something sincere, because somewhere, someone else may be carrying the same silent confusion, and in that moment, they might realize they are not alone. St. Faustina lived this reality repeatedly. In her spiritual diary, where she recorded her deep interior encounters with God, she describes moments during the Holy Mass when an overwhelming presence of God would come upon her and tears would flow without resistance. These were not ordinary tears. Sometimes they were tears of indescribable joy, so intense that her heart could barely contain them. At other times, they were tears of deep sorrow, not only for herself, but for the suffering of the world. And at times, they were tears of a love so profound that it felt like a gentle fire within her soul. She wrote that during Mass, she often felt such a powerful presence of God that tears would run down her face continuously, unnoticed by others, but fully seen and understood by Jesus. That single realization changes everything, because it means that even when no one else understands your tears, they are not ignored. They are seen, they are known, they are received. In another passage, Faustina records a profound interior message that reshapes the meaning of spiritual crying entirely. Jesus tells her that her tears are not weakness, but the fire of the soul. Fire of the soul. Not weakness, not emotional excess, not loss of control, but fire. And fire does not only consume, it also purifies, reveals, and transforms what it touches. Through this understanding, tears are no longer seen as emotional overflow, but as a language of the inner life that appears when words are no longer enough. Faustina learned that these tears were not something to suppress or analyze with human logic. They were a grace, a spiritual gift that emerges when the heart becomes open enough to be touched by divine presence. Not every soul experiences this, and not every moment carries it, but when it appears, it is not random. It is a sign that something within has begun to awaken, and in this awakening, something subtle begins to change. Faith is no longer only understood as outward strength, discipline, or silence. It also becomes something vulnerable, something open, something that can break and still remain faithful. Like soil that cracks before receiving rain, the soul sometimes must open before grace can enter fully. Perhaps you have spent years attending Mass without feeling anything significant, simply going through the motions, present physically but distant inwardly. And then one day, unexpectedly, without emotional preparation, tears came. And in that moment, something shifted. Not because everything became clear, but because something became real. That moment of crying may have been the first opening through which grace began to enter in a deeper way. Jesus does not seek hearts that are merely composed on the surface. He seeks hearts that are real. And sometimes the only way a soul becomes real again in its own experience is through tears that cannot be explained, cannot be controlled, and cannot be planned. In that moment, crying is no longer a problem to solve. It becomes a sign to understand the soul is still alive, still sensitive, still capable of recognizing its creator. And from this recognition, a deeper mystery begins to unfold, one that goes far beyond emotion alone. When this recognition happens inside the soul, something very subtle begins to shift, almost without the person realizing it. The tears that appear during Mass are not always about sadness or emotional overwhelm. In many cases, they are the first sign that the soul has recognized something it cannot fully explain but cannot ignore either. It is not a mental process. It does not come through reasoning or reflection. It is immediate, deep, and silent, as if the inner being suddenly responds to a presence it has always known but forgotten in daily life. There is a very specific moment in the Mass where this often becomes stronger. It is not predictable and it is not the same for everyone, but it frequently happens when the mystery of the Eucharist becomes most present, when ordinary elements are believed to become something far greater than what the senses can perceive. In that moment, there is no visible change in the environment, yet something invisible feels different. The soul that is open begins to perceive this not as an idea, but as a reality, and that reality is overwhelming in a quiet way. Saint Faustina described this experience in her own words, explaining that there were moments during the Eucharist when she felt the presence of Jesus so strongly that she could not contain what was happening inside her. It was not fear and it was not sorrow. It was closeness, it was truth, it was love without any barrier. And when love like that enters a human heart, it often produces a response that cannot be controlled. The body reacts before the mind can explain, and tears become the natural expression of something too large to hold inside. At this stage, crying is not confusion, it is recognition. The soul is not reacting randomly, it is responding to presence. Just like a child recognizes a familiar voice without needing explanation, the soul responds to its creator in a way that bypasses logic. It simply knows, and when it knows, it softens, it opens. It breaks in the only way it can, not in destruction, but in surrender. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening inside them. They think something emotional has taken over, or that they are overly sensitive. But what is actually happening is something much deeper. It is a confrontation between the eternal and the fragile, between divine presence and human limitation. And in that encounter, the human heart does not collapse, it reveals itself. St. Faustina also understood that these moments were not about emotional intensity alone. They were about truth being revealed in the deepest part of the soul. When a person stands before God in a real way, all inner layers that usually stay hidden begin to surface. The effort to appear strong, composed, or unaffected starts to fall away naturally, and what remains is something simple and honest, a soul that is fully seen and cannot hide. This is why tears often come with a sense of exposure. Not shame, but truth. It is not about being judged, it is about being known. In everyday life, people build layers of control, identity, and protection. But in moments of deep spiritual encounter, especially during the Eucharist, those layers become unnecessary. The soul realizes it does not need to maintain them in that presence. And when that realization settles in, emotions often break through as tears. Many people also discover something unexpected in this experience. The tears are not always linked to personal suffering. Sometimes there is no specific memory, no clear reason, no emotional trigger, yet the response is still there. This is because the source is not always personal pain. Sometimes it is a deeper spiritual sensitivity, an awareness of something greater than the self. The soul begins to sense not only its own reality, but something of the weight of what it is standing before. In this way, crying during Mass becomes less about emotional reaction and more about spiritual awareness. It is a form of perception that goes beyond the mind. The soul is not thinking its way into tears. It is encountering something that naturally produces them. And because of that, the experience often leaves a person with a quiet sense of change afterward, even if nothing external has changed at all. St. Faustina's writings repeatedly point to this same truth. She understood that what happens in these moments is not meant to be fully explained or controlled. It is meant to be received. The soul does not need to analyze the experience in order for it to have meaning. Its meaning is already present in the encounter itself. And from here, something even deeper begins to emerge, because recognition is only the beginning. Once the soul recognizes, it begins to open in ways that reach far beyond emotion, moving into something closer to healing and interior transformation. Once the soul moves from simple recognition into openness, something deeper begins to unfold within. The tears that once felt confusing slowly take on a different meaning. They are no longer just an unexpected reaction during Mass, but part of an interior process that the person does not fully control or even fully understand. It is as if something within has begun to loosen, layer by layer, in places that were closed for a long time without even being noticed. This is where a quieter, more hidden movement begins. The soul is not only recognizing a presence anymore, it is being touched in places that carry memory, pain, and silence. Not always obvious pain, not always conscious memories, but deeper inner wounds that have been carried for years. These are the parts of a person that rarely speak in daily life, the parts that have learned to stay strong, to stay quiet, to keep functioning without interruption. St. Faustina described moments like this in her spiritual experience as well. She understood that when the presence of God becomes deeply real to the soul, it does not only bring comfort, it also brings light into places that were previously hidden. And when light reaches those hidden areas, the natural response is often not words, but tears. Not because the person is breaking down, but because something inside is finally being seen and gently released. In this stage, crying during Mass often becomes more interior and less about visible emotion. It may not even be dramatic. It can be quiet, steady, almost unnoticed by others. But inside, something significant is happening. The soul begins to release what it has carried silently for a long time. Unresolved emotions, unspoken burdens, and spiritual exhaustion that was never fully acknowledged. This is why many people are surprised after such moments. They may not have been thinking about anything painful, yet they still feel lighter afterward or strangely calm, even if they cannot explain why. That sense of calm is not accidental. It is often the result of something being gently released in the presence of God, without force and without pressure. St. Faustina's experiences highlight this reality clearly. She wrote about moments where she felt an overwhelming interior movement during prayer, and the Eucharist where her own emotional state was not the cause, but the presence she was experiencing became the space where everything unspoken in her heart could surface safely. In those moments, tears were not a sign of instability. They were a sign that the soul had entered a place where it no longer needed to hold everything together. Many people live for years in a constant state of holding themselves together. They become strong for others, responsible in their duties, composed in public, and emotionally restrained by necessity. Over time, this becomes normal, but the soul remembers everything it had to suppress in order to survive. And when it finally encounters a moment of deep spiritual safety, even if only briefly during Mass, that internal pressure begins to release. Tears in this context are not collapse, they are release. They are the moment when what was tightly held begins to soften. And what makes this experience so profound is that it often happens without explanation. The person does not need to understand every reason behind it. The healing is not dependent on full understanding. It is happening in a deeper layer of the soul. St. Faustina also recognized that this movement of interior healing was gradual. It was not a single moment that fixed everything. Rather, it was a repeated opening of the heart over time. Each encounter with the Eucharist, each moment of surrender, each tear that was not resisted contributed to a slow transformation within her interior life. This is important to understand because it removes the pressure to interpret every emotional experience immediately. The soul is not required to analyze every tear in real time. In fact, overanalysis can interrupt what is naturally unfolding. The key is not control, but openness. Not explanation, but trust. As this process continues, something even more subtle begins to appear. The tears are no longer only about personal healing or emotional release. They begin to take on a wider dimension, one that goes beyond the individual. The soul starts to feel connected to something larger, something that extends beyond personal experience into a deeper spiritual participation. And it is from here that another layer of this mystery begins to reveal itself, where tears are no longer only about the self, but begin to touch something far more universal and hidden. As this inner journey deepens, something unexpected begins to happen within the soul. The experience of tears during Mass slowly expands beyond personal emotions or individual healing. It is no longer only about what the person has lived, what they have carried, or what they have suffered. There is a shift, subtle but real, where the heart begins to feel connected to something larger than itself, something it cannot fully name but cannot separate from either. In these moments, the tears often feel different. They carry a weight that is not entirely personal. The person may not be thinking about their own life at all, and yet the emotion is still there. It feels as if the sorrow or longing being experienced is not limited to a single story, but is connected to many stories, many lives, many unseen realities. This is where the mystery becomes even more profound, because the soul begins to participate in something it did not consciously choose, yet somehow recognizes. Saint Faustina described experiences like this in her spiritual life, where prayer and Eucharistic encounters would sometimes move her beyond her own personal concerns. She noticed that there were moments when her interior suffering or tears were not clearly connected to her own situation. Instead, they seemed to extend outward, as if she were sharing in a deeper spiritual reality that involved others. She understood this not as confusion, but as a form of spiritual participation. In this state, the soul begins to enter a kind of silent solidarity with others. It is no longer isolated in its own experience. It becomes aware in a very interior way of the brokenness, distance, and longing that exists in the world. This awareness is not intellectual. It is not based on news, stories, or observation. It is something felt at a spiritual level during moments of deep encounter in the presence of God. This is where tears can become a form of hidden intercession. The person is not necessarily speaking prayers aloud or forming structured intentions. Yet something within is being offered silently. The tears themselves become a language of offering, a way of carrying what cannot be fully expressed in words. In this sense, the soul is no longer only receiving, it is also participating. St. Faustina's writings reflect this reality with remarkable depth. She understood that certain moments of suffering or interior movement in prayer were not only about her personal sanctification, but also connected to a wider spiritual mystery involving other souls. She often perceived that what she was experiencing had a dimension beyond herself, even when she did not fully understand the extent of it. This does not mean that every tear carries the same meaning or that every emotional moment in Mass is identical. Rather, it reveals that the spiritual life is not confined to individual experience alone. There are moments when the boundaries between personal prayer and spiritual solidarity become less defined, and the soul finds itself participating in something larger than its own awareness. At this stage, the person may begin to notice that the tears feel more purposeful, even if they remain unexplained. There is a quiet sense that something is being carried, something is being offered, something is being placed before God without needing to fully articulate it. And in that silence, the soul is not passive. It is active in a deeply hidden way. This experience can also bring a strange sense of exhaustion afterward, not physical exhaustion, but a deeper interior weight, as if something meaningful has taken place beyond words. At the same time, there is often peace accompanying it, a calm recognition that what was experienced was not empty or meaningless, even if it cannot be fully described. Saint Faustina came to understand that this dimension of spiritual life does not require full comprehension to be real. The soul is not always meant to analyze what is happening in the moment. Instead, it is invited to remain open, to allow what is being done within to take its course without resistance or fear. And as this openness grows, another layer begins to emerge, one that concerns not only personal healing or hidden intercession, but the way the soul learns to live differently even outside the moment of Mass, carrying this sensitivity into everyday life in a quiet and lasting way. As this spiritual sensitivity continues to mature, something quiet but deeply transformative begins to extend into everyday life. What once happened only in the sacred silence of Mass slowly starts to shape how the soul perceives the world outside of it. The tears may no longer appear with the same intensity or frequency, but something far more lasting remains: a changed interior awareness, a softened way of seeing, and a deeper attentiveness to God's presence in ordinary moments. St. Faustina's experience shows this progression clearly. Over time, she came to understand that the grace behind those moments of tears was not meant to remain confined to emotional experiences during prayer. Instead, it was forming something within her. It was shaping her sensitivity, refining her perception, and teaching her to recognize God not only in moments of intensity, but also in silence, in dryness, and in simplicity. The emotional experiences were not the goal, they were part of a deeper formation. This is why, as the spiritual life matures, tears become less about constant emotional expression and more about inner transformation. The soul begins to carry a quiet memory of having been touched by something real, something beyond explanation. And even when emotions are absent, that memory remains. It becomes a kind of interior anchor that holds the person steady in moments of spiritual dryness or uncertainty. Many people misunderstand this stage. They think that if the tears stop, something has been lost. But in reality, What has happened is that the soul is being invited into a more stable and deeper form of relationship with God, one that does not depend on visible signs or emotional reactions, but on trust and interior fidelity. The earlier experiences of tears were like openings, but what follows is a more sustained presence. Saint Faustina also discovered that this interior transformation naturally affected how she lived among others. Her compassion deepened, not in an emotional or sentimental way, but in a quiet and practical sensitivity. She became more aware of hidden suffering, more attentive to the needs of others, and more ready to respond in prayer even when no one asked her to. The inner life shaped the outer life without forcing it. This is one of the most important fruits of these experiences. The soul becomes less focused on itself and more open to others, not because it tries harder, but because it has been softened from within. What once was held tightly inside begins to flow outward in subtle ways: patience, understanding, restraint, and a deeper capacity to accompany others in their struggles. At the same time, Faustina learned something essential about balance. She realized that these experiences, whether tears or dryness, are not meant to be measured as signs of spiritual success or failure. They are part of a living relationship that cannot be reduced to emotional patterns. There are seasons of intensity and seasons of silence, and both are necessary. Both are part of the same journey. This understanding frees the soul from confusion. It removes the pressure to chase certain experiences or fear their absence. Instead, it brings a simple focus back to what is essential: remaining open, remaining faithful, remaining present before God without conditions. The tears, when they come, are received. When they do not come, trust remains. In this way, the entire mystery comes full circle. What begins as an unexplained emotional response in the silence of Mass becomes, over time, a deeper interior formation that shapes how a person lives, loves, and perceives reality itself. The tears are no longer the center. They are part of a larger transformation that leads the soul into greater simplicity and truth. St. Faustina's journey reveals that God often works most deeply not through constant intensity, but through a gradual shaping of the heart. The moments of crying, the silence that follows, the peace that remains afterward, and even the dryness that sometimes returns are all part of a single movement of grace. Nothing is wasted, nothing is meaningless, and so, what may have once seemed like confusion or emotional overflow is revealed as something far more profound. A quiet encounter with the divine that begins in tears but matures into trust, stability, and a lasting awareness that God is near, even when nothing is felt.